Thank you all for coming, especially on a weekday at 7 p.m., where you could be having a cocktail, a pico sour, and having a good time, and you come to hear such a dense and deprecating topic like this. Look, this talk is also going to be demanding, because so much has been written about the history of Nazism, and so much has been said, and there are so many angles that one can investigate that, well, it is eternal basically. So one could be talking for years about this topic. What I am going to do in this talk is basically to show why Nazism is socialism, and why it is anti-capitalism, and why it does not have a fundamental difference with communism or Marxism. Okay, to which people who today are in the currency idea, for example. And this is going to lead us to an investigation of direct sources. And therefore this is a different presentation from others that I normally do with very little text. This is going to have more text, because you are going to have to read out loud the same protagonists. What they really thought, okay. Why did I put Nazism socialism? This is the title of a report made by and elaborated by Friedrich Hayek, who was the first Nobel Prize winner in economics. He was Austrian. And he sent the whole rise of the Nazis in Europe. He was from Vienna, precisely one of the cities where Hitler lived, and a liberal thinker who, as you know, is a reference for all of us today, who writes this report and sends it to Scott Beveridge, who was at the London School of Economics at that time, who was the great president and director, and he calls it Nazism socialism. Because already at that time the false theory that the Nazis were a capitalist reaction was running against the revolutionary socialist movements. And basically what Hayek said is not true. So I titled it the same way. Why? Because Nazism socialism. And if you notice, the left always tries to talk about fascism more than about Nazism. The concept of Nazism, they hardly use it. Why? Because it complicates them that Nazism means National Socialism. Because they say, no, it is that it was not socialism of us, the good. It was socialism of the bad, okay? So they prefer to talk about fascism instead of talking about Nazism. And here, after this position, I hope it is clear to you that the National Socialist philosophy, apart from the racial ingredient that we are also going to talk about, is a philosophy that today you can see to a certain extent quite represented in large-scale movements, such as the Communist Party of Chile and others. I insist on the part of racial supremacy, which is another different thing that we have seen in our country. Of course, so far. So, well, before getting into the subject, I want to make some small biographical comments of Hitler, who is the character that here looks like a diabolical doll. This is a photo that I found of him when he was a child. I see something like that, something scratching. I mean, I think Chucky hides from Hitler at that age. Well, he was born in 1889 in an Austrian town called Braunau am Main, and Hitler's father is the illegitimate son of a marriage. He is an unrecognized bastard, whose original surname is Skikogruber. That is the family name of the mother of Hitler's father, but he adopts the name of his mother-in-law, the surname of his mother-in-law, and from there he follows, I accept, the line down with Hitler. What characterizes Hitler's father? This is important. He is a little bourgeois person, but a very little bourgeois middle-class bourgeois. And the only thing he tries all his life is to try to show that he is someone in the context of the town where he lives. He's a tremendous social resentful. He is a very socially frustrated person. with a lot of rage. And this rage comes from Hitler. There is a question that defines Hitler's psyche, and this is important to be clear. And this is what Emil Ludwig says in his biography. One of the greatest biographers of the 20th century, Ludwig interviewed Stalin. He interviewed Mussolini, and he writes a book about these three dictators, which I highly recommend. And he says, well, it is social resentment, this social rage of Hitler. Hitler is a person who shows certain rebellion and an ability to fit in from the beginning, and he does not finish school. He does not have an A+, as they say in German. A school, he does not have a certificate of having finished school. High school, nothing. Then the mother is frustrated and says, well, go to Vienna, because he wanted to be an artist. So Hitler practically never worked in his life. If he had lived in Chile, he would be a militant and a broad-minded person. Well, I do not leave them any doubt. And he goes to Vienna with the illusion of entering the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, but they find him a little talented. They do not find him talented enough. If he postulates twice, if he does not have a bad memory, and they reject him, and then they reject him in architecture, and they say to him, maybe he could be an architect, and they send him to postulate, but since he does not have a certificate of having finished school, then, well, they make it worse, but you do not even finish school, so forget it. And this generates a lot of frustration. This is a painting that he painted. Hitler painted paintings. You see it on the internet, and you realize that they are not so bad, really. And this is a painting that he painted. And one of the ways he maintained himself, he lived with a lot of poverty, in sheltered homes, financed by a lot of Jews, as in these homeless houses that one sees in the movies in the United States. But in Vienna at the end of the last century, and in those circles in Vienna, he develops two things. He exposes himself to strongly anti-Semitic discourses that are in fashion at that time, and that starts to influence him strongly. And he begins to develop a little resentment with the Jews who keep him directly through these foundations, through these sheltered homes, for poor people who are in the streets. And he also lives with poor Jews who are in these sheltered homes, and who are people who arrive as true vagrants, who arrive dirty, smelly, and so on. And then he begins to extract a general conclusion that all Jews are like that, from that type of experience. And the other thing he develops is what Emil Ludwig explains, which is a strong anti-Burgish feeling. It is not a resentment with nobility, with the count, with the dukes, who see them very far away. It is not their point of reference, but rather the bourgeois who have money, that bourgeoisie, merchant, in which he sees a lot of injustice, and he gives him a scratch because in the end, he wants to be like them. That is, he is an envious person. He is an envious person of Tomo and Lobo. And then, well, he says, I'm going from Austria to Germany, and he celebrates when the First World War begins. One of the things that Hitler celebrates, or above all the things, is, well, now I finally have a role. I belong to something bigger. And they get ready to go to the front of combat, to go to war. Now, in the war, they say that he receives the Iron Cross for an act of courage that he supposedly captured 12 French. But the stories that have been reviewed, at least the historians who have done the work of investigating this, it seems that it is not so. That Hitler was a coward in the war. He was not a person of great courage, much less. And that, in reality, he was more in the state, moving papers, and all this story that he was so brave, and everything else seems to have been a great exaggeration, and that he always used the Iron Cross to pretend that he was a hero, a military hero, when in reality he was not. And like Hermann Göring, who, as you know, was one of the closest to his Iron Circle, that Hermann Göring was indeed one of the best pilots of the First World War, and he was a national hero because he had shot 22 planes. After he died in combat in Manfred von Richthofen, the great, the famous Red Baron, one of those who inherits this stamp of a hero, is Göring, who was also a different character, a character of aristocracy, of high class. And he indeed had a well-deserved status of legend in the First World War, which later was very useful for Hitler to use it to connect with certain elites and other things. So well that happens with him. And where does Hitler end up later? In Munich. This is all part of Munich. If you have been to Munich, the Hauptprior House, which is famous for drinking beer, eating there, you can see that many meetings of the Nazis, of the very first National Socialist movement, take place there in Munich. In these typical Bavarian breweries, the Hauptprior House is one of the best known. What does Hitler work on? Well, Hitler works as a spy of the German army in this reactionary movement against the established order they are forming. So he begins to go to hear the meetings of these people who were actually veterans, some old people who are there talking about how bad Germany is and that the Jews have everything taken and they are subjecting us. And he supposedly goes to report what danger these organizations can mean. And he begins to hear them, and he begins to say, you know what, you're right. And one day, being there as a spy, he, so that you can see how things are, takes the word and gives a speech and unleashes all his anger and everything else. And the speech he gives is so impressive that, well, applause. And there was a man, right, who is one of the founders, because there is a party that is before the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. It is the German Workers' Party, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, which is this one. This was the logo, and there was the party of the German workers, supercapitalist right, the party of the German workers right, and this is shortly after we are talking about the Russian Revolution. That is, more or less at the same time, and this party is founded by a worker, a blacksmith, from Bavaria, Anton Drexler, and a journalist, who was called Karl Harrer, among others, and it is a party fundamentally anti-Semitic, nationalist, in terms of basically Germany first, humiliation, war, and everything else, and revolutionary, in terms of class struggle, a bit the rich against the poor, but also this racial thing, or against the bourgeois. And here this is a very important factor. Several of the members of this party, of this formation that is taking place, are members of an esoteric and occultist society called the Chile Society, that some of you have heard of. I studied the history of all occultist societies, but there is one that had the influence. Probably the one that had the most influence in human history was this one. And what did you think of the Chile, which is the shaft? You can see that that's where the swastika comes from. Hitler didn't invent the swastika. The swastika comes. This is taken in a very old symbol that is found in cultures in India, elsewhere, millennial, and they take it because the thesis of this esoteric society is that there exists the superior race, which is that of the Aryans, and other Germans are the descendants of this superior race, except it is the thesis of this society, of this group, and that there is a kind of clash of civilizations with other groups, especially the Jews, who want to corrupt and destroy the Aryan race, the German race, and want the way of corrupting them, mixing with other races, living the purity of the blood, and they have all kinds of madness in that sense. And what it is about is to recover racial purity in soil, blood and bone. That's what this esoteric issue is about. One of the main members of the Chile Society is a German poet called Dietrich, and this guy turns out to be very, very relevant, because he writes and says before Hitler appears on the scene, that Germany needs a Messiah who is going to restore glory and take us to the universe. Sorry, to the kingdom of the 1,000 years, which is the typical eschatological millenarism that you can also see in the book of the Bible, in the Revelations. So who is going to save us and bring us to the earth? Basically, something like that. When he sees Hitler, he says, this is. And without Eckhart, Hitler would never have arrived alive. Hitler takes him. He sees the potential in this person. And he says, this is the one who is going to generate change. And he grabs him and starts polishing him. Because Hitler was a person, he is what he calls complicated. A person who didn't know how to eat. He was a disaster, very clumsy, very rough. So when Eckhart began to present him a little more in society, he was badly off. So Eckhart begins to polish him and begins to help him with the things he writes. Eckhart also had a diary showing that this is still a small group of people. Here he has not yet skipped the whole process of the national growth of socialism. And Eckhart is clear about one thing. He is clear, for him, in all this delusional, mythological disease, this civilizational racial conflict, that is going to end, probably leading to the extermination of the Jewish race. Because if the Jewish race is not exterminated, then the losers are the others, the Germans, the Aryans. So he says yes. Look, maybe we are inhuman. It is prophetic what he says in one of his poems, because he effectively points out, maybe it is atrocious that we have to do, but if it consists or leads to the salvation of the Aryan race, it ends up being moral, prophetic. He did not live to see everything that happened later. He died before. But this is a very, very important character. Romanticism. This idea of putting feelings above reason plays an essential role in the rise of German National Socialism, of these revolutionary impulses, the paradise on earth, this utopism, etc. And in 1920 the German National Socialist Party was founded, which is based on the German National Workers' Party. It is a worker party. This is important, and takes again the swastika as a symbol of the party that we all know. And here we enter a bit into the bottom of the matter of why this is a socialist party. And basically it is anti-capitalist, an anti-capitalist party, an anti-bourgeois. That's what it is. So it is a revolutionary movement against capitalism, which is directly associated with the Jews. Capitalism, Judaism, financial capitalism, the Jews, with the ruin of the German economic systems, which are very bad. After the First World War, this is before the hyperinflation that comes in the year 2223, and then the party emits when it is founded. A 25-point program. I took some out, not here, but you can see that they are obviously completely anti-liberal and anti-capitalist. What? The acts of individuals cannot contradict the interests of the community. This is done by the Nazis. The interest of the community is prior to the acts of individuals. The community understood and defined as the, obviously understood by the Nazis, as the collective body, the German social organism, the Volksgemeinschaft. Yes. So it says, first, only those of the race can be citizens. And, well, that is important. This is an essential part of the party. No Jew can be a member of the race. This is the racial thing about it. But then comes pure economic issues. They have to abolish all the income that is not based on production. The profit is over. Someone said that, do you agree? The profit is bad. The profit is bad. Except when you are working in the fields doing your things. There, you can stay with the profit. But the profit, by definition, is bad, in general terms. So, the interests are over. The profit of the interests. I can't give you a credit to collect your interests. Those who were fundamentally involved in the credit business are the Jews. That is why they relate all this capitalism with the Jews as well. But it is not only that. It is not only a race issue. The Nazis could not be pro-capitalist. It is a delirious thing to say that the Nazis were pro-capitalist if they understood that capitalism was at hand with the supposed race that explodes through the financial system and everything else, the nationalization of all the associated companies to form a monopoly. At that time, in Germany, it was almost all companies, because we did not have integrated markets open to the system. In other words, nationalization is a company who determines which companies are associated to form a monopoly? Well, themselves. Then, the distribution of profit of the whole heavy industry. What is the heart of the Lebanese economy? The heavy industry. What was the heart of the Lebanese economy? We have to distribute. Do these Adam Smiths seem very capitalist, very liberal? Or does this sound more like a Socialist Party program? Or a broad front? Yes or no? Of course. This has nothing to do with it. But we have to take the time to read these things. And apart from that, we are recording this so that people can see it on YouTube and say, I have no idea about that. But that's how the Socialist Party starts. A large-scale pension system for the elderly. And one can say, well, that's fine. The Nazis said it, but it's something that, yes, but obviously what they had thought was a state pension system that came from the time of Bismarck, in which everyone was dependent on the state, the distribution system. What is done in Chile, the first country in the world, is to go against the state pension system of Bismarck and the Nazis. And what do our governors want to do today? Go back to the Nazi pension system. That for the rest. And people in many parts of the world still. I don't want to say because it is a party with a Nazi system, but you are saying that citizens have to depend on the state, on the political power, because that's how you control them. And that's what Bismarck said, and I have it in my book. He says literally that the idea of a pension system, this distribution, is to control people because as they depend on the pension that you are going to give them, they are subject to the power of the state and the authority and the king. In this case, we are the Prussian king. More clearly, no one can agree with a distribution pension system if they believe in freedom, and even less if they believe in the state's financial solvency, because they are also insolvent. Of course, agrarian reform to free trade land for the purposes of public utility. Who came up with that in Chile? No, Alessandro didn't come up with it. Alessandro was imposed by the Alliance for Progress, and it was fundamentally designed by Rolpruber and other people under the government of a Democrat Kennedy. And Alessandro, as he had doubts, was called the agrarian reformer because he was still contemplating the payment, not the free expropriation, the real payment of what you have. That later changed. And who accelerated this process? Eduardo Frei Montalva, who was a great admirer of Mussolini, and who has articles of the Hitler's giants. That is in the book of Victor Feria, of La Muerte del Camelón. He has all the documents, but especially after Salvador Allende, the left. The agrarian reform was not only in Chile, but in all of Latin America. Again, you weren't necessarily a Nazi if you believed in agrarian reform, but what you definitely aren't is someone who believes in capitalism or private property. In other words, agrarian reform, that in addition to the beginning of the 20th century, the earth is still an important source of wealth in many places. In Germany it wasn't irrelevant, no matter how much it was an industrialized country. So, look, we want to take away, steal. That is appropriate without paying all these people. So they only used the Nazis in the year 1920. No, but they were capitalists. They were liberals. What the fuck are they talking about? But what the fuck are they talking about? The Nazis are socialists. Socialists just like the socialists who govern us in Chile. Identical in their economic philosophy. Identical. Then we will see some differences that there are with Marxism and communism in the Soviet Union, but otherwise anti-capitalism is the essence of Nazism, unless you believe that this is capitalism, right? The agrarian reform. Well, fighting all those who act against the general interest. And what is that? Obviously it is totalitarianism, because who defines what is the general interest? The Socialist National Party. It is a bit the idea of Fernando Mendoza, the other model of the public interest region. What was the public interest region? I analyzed it in the Latin of equality. The public interest region was a state that controlled everything that the authors called social rights. And what are social rights? Obviously health, education and pensions. The state had to control it 100%, which is not to control education, health and pensions. It is to control the people who go to school, the teachers and the students. It is to control all the doctors and all the people who go to attend the health service from the political power. But not only that, in that book they said that the social rights that they mention are not taxative, it is an expansive figure. So finally, everything they define that can become social rights has to be monopolized. The state. Monopolized. What is that? If it is not fascism, if it is not Nazism, it is fascism. Read the book of Another Model and realize. And what does it say? The public interest region is the public interest region. They also put it up. Adri, Chernyan, all of them. I think Adri wrote it, the others signed it. But hey, they left the signature, so one can criticize them. And this is very important, and that is why the state and education had to separate by 1%. There should not be any school in the hands of the state. Everything should be privatized. And pass it to the people in money, so they can send their children to good schools. Because also in the Ministry of Education, at least in Chile and everywhere, in reality, they bring an important part of the budget, in bureaucracy, in spillage, all the corruptions that we have seen, instead of passing that money directly to the people so they can send their children to school. So it says that the school has to instill the concept of the state. The school has to instill the concept of the state as soon as the child is trained for it. We ask that the state pay for the education of the children with interactive data on the outcome. If they are poor parents, without considering their position or profession, the state has to instill in the mind the people who believe in that. The liberals believe that the children have to be obtained with the concept of the state in their heads. Or the socialists, that the people in the broad front here, the Churches in Latin America, the Kirchneristas, the people who continue in Valmorna in Mexico, who believes in this? I think I could end the presentation here. I think I convinced them that the Nazis were not capitalists or liberals, but I will continue, because there are people who may not be convinced yet. Well, last, remember the national well-being, protecting mothers and children, providing children's work, equipping them with physical exercise. Well, these are things that were a bit of the fashion of the time. And there are some points that one could even say that it is okay to provide children's work. It is also something, if you see as being against children's work. Well, but there are children, for example, who work in the film industry and earn tons of money. And you say, well, let them try to work. Obviously, they did not have that in mind at that time. They had a much harder job than that, but in general. And then here, there's a point that is important regarding fascism, because you have realized that it is not us liberals who believe in the case of fascists. How many times have I not been told, and have been told, I do not know, to my family and to everyone? See what Mussolini says. Where Mussolini explains the doctrine of fascism. This is the text that he wrote, and he defines and explains. Look, fascism is this. Fascism is this. He says that the conception of fascism is anti-individualist. It highlights the importance of the state and accepts that individuals, only in the day that their interests coincide with those of the state. That is fascism, Mussolini says. Now you're going to see that Mussolini did not know anything about fascism. What did Mussolini know about fascism? It is opposed to classical liberalism. Mussolini says, look, we are a reaction against liberalism. That is, fascism is exactly the opposite to what we defend in the Foundation for Progress. Classical liberalism. Mussolini says it, and I am not saying it, but I will continue. He says, liberalism denies the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reaffirms it. And Mussolini adds in that same text, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state, everything within the state. That is why it is a totalitarian system, because totalitarianism implies the complete politicization of society and individual life. Nothing of what we do, absolutely nothing, outside the state control. That is why Yo-Yo Jackson wanted to status the athlete, because he is a fascist, because there can be nothing outside the state, that is, those who control power, must have the absolute control of our lives. Civil society cannot exist outside the state. Mussolini's fascism was in many ways weaker than Nazism in Germany, and definitely than the Soviet Union. We will see later, but Mussolini says it. I mean, I don't say it. Now, an interesting fact about Mussolini. In the interview that Emoladu tells, Mussolini says, but if I was a communist, if communism transited to fascism, but I was a communist, what could be if not socialist? I would have been a communist, and I would have been defined as an authoritarian communist. Mussolini comes from communism, and a fact that few people know. Mussolini, who also went hungry, went through a lot of problems, from a personal, economic point of view, etc. Do you know what he had in his pocket? Always. A Hamlet, a medal from Karl Marx. It is historical. Mussolini always carried in his pocket a metal medal from Karl Marx. Mussolini has hundreds of quotes from Karl Marx. I had read it, and he had bought it completely. This is class struggle. What happens is that later in fascism, he transits being a furious anti-capitalist to a more pragmatic position regarding class struggle as an armed revolution for clothes for everything. And in that sense, Mussolini's fascism is much less bloody than the Leninist revolution, much less. But think about it. On the one hand, Mussolini says, look, we are the opposite of liberalism. Don't confuse us here with these criminals. We are the real ones. The ones who want everything to be in the state, and the work to be done by us. And on the other hand, he carries a medal from Karl Marx in his pocket. Who does he look more like? The people in the wide front, the Socialist Party, and the entire Latin American left, even the Europeans, or the liberals who defend the minimum state. If we are the complete opposite, never forget the fact that Mussolini, so that when they argue with a left-wing friend, he never misses the left wing. Who doesn't have a friend? Yes, because he couldn't be left-wing if he was a trained person, unless he already has a deviation of character. I think, hey, but if Mussolini in some way is Karl Marx, then yes. For many years he had that medal. Yes. In fact, he has a lot of praise to Marx too. And he is not the only one. Now, this is Adolf Hitler. Let's go to German socialism and socialism. What does Hitler say? The same as Mussolini? In 1933, Hitler says, if the liberal movement in its deification of the individual must lead to the destruction of the people, the National Socialism, therefore, wants to safeguard the people as such, if it is necessary, even at the expense of the individual. Of course, this is water. Huh? So, this could be in the Works Government Program. The people right, the people first, who talks like that all the time. The communists, left-wing people. The people, not the individual. The individual destroys the people, pursuing their selfish interests and everything else. This was done by Hitler in 1933. He says it is essential that the individual
gradually understands that his own ego is insignificant compared to the existence of the whole people, the collective right, and safeguarding the position of the single ego is determined exclusively by the interests of the people as a whole. We are the people. Who is the people? Well, the who embodies the people, the power of the state, let's say. And then he says, above all to understand that the freedom of thought and will of a nation, the nation, has freedom of thought. Look at the categories of collectivists. No, because if we are the nation, in all this group that is here, we have freedom of thought. What Hitler is saying is that we have freedom of thought as a group, but not as each one. As an individual. What is your name? Kimberly. Not you, but all together, so you can talk. You neither. No, it's the group, not any of you in particular. But the group is me, because the people is me. Then the right to think is you. And if you are against me, you are against the people, which is me. Does that seem liberal to him? No. And then he ends up saying, the highest interest of the community, from here to put limits on the interests of the people and to impose duties on them. That is, Hitler is saying, if we are the opposite of liberalism, according to his great friend and ally Mussolini, Mussolini says if we are the opposite of classic liberalism, then we are the opposite, we are the same classic. But the leftists come to say, no, it is that the Nazis were allies, or they were liberal capitalists, they were right-wing. They try to manipulate those who think in the free market, but think about it before entering the economic part. Specifically, how can there be a free market if you have, under the philosophy, that the interests of the individual have to be completely subjected to those of the collective? How are you going to pursue your interests? That is the essence of the free market, that everyone pursues their goals, produces what they want to produce, exchanges what they want to exchange, works what they want to work, freedom of price, freedom of contract, pursuing our goals. That is incompatible with a collectivist idea in which the individual has to be subjected to the goals of the collective, that who determines them. If the collective is not today, tell me what your goals are. The one who attributes himself to the position of representing the collective, to the dictator Stalin, Castro, Hitler, Chávez, the Alen, anyone, all this. They also have an interest in the people, the collective, whatever. Or the Nazis use the concept of people all the time. The essence of the discourse of the Nazis in rhetoric is the concept of folk, the people. It is not that they talked about the individual, and this, the people, just like the communists all the time. The people. That is, it is not something. And here you have the economic downfall that Hitler makes. These are Hitler's statements. What is the economic interpretation of this collectivist philosophy? And why am I citing them? Because if I say so, you're not going to see the quote and the textual source. What did this guy say to understand well? These are quotes that are never reproduced anywhere, and it is very necessary to know them. Then he says we will have to give up the idea that individual benefit is the most important thing. Individual benefit is not profit. No, don't come with the thing profit. That is not the most important thing. And that the individual's own interest derives from the benefit of the set. That is, Hitler is saying, contrary to what he was saying, who? Adam Smith? Adam Smith says, but precisely the opposite is the return of the nations. There I am going to show it to you. Then he says, the benefit of the community determines the individual benefit, not the other way around. Of course, because if you have the idea of controlling total power, the only thing you have to do is to control it. That is, the only thing you have to do is to control total power. The only way to do it is by claiming that you are the voice of the people and the interest of the community, that you embody it. You can't say that each person pursuing their interest is going to improve society spontaneously. As you said there, the spontaneous order. No, because I want to control it all. I can't leave them in freedom of action. If I have to invent a rhetoric, I have to tell you,
in this tribalism, that if you act on each one side, you are going to harm everyone as a whole. So do what I tell you have to do. I have to control you, because I understand your good, the good of the people where you belong better than you. And I have to impose it even on you if necessary, because I represent the people. I have access to a truth that you don't, because each one of you is inferior. So you are looking at your own interest, while I am capable of the interest of the whole. Right? That's what's behind this. And what does it say? Oh, if we go to people to pursue their individual interest, they are going to follow an egoism that will destroy the community. Who do we hear this from all the time? Who says all the time that if you let the market play with freedom, and that people pursue their interest, and everything else they're going to destroy the community? Who says this? Also Pope Francis, yes. But the Church has a position. Well, it depends. Pope Francis, who is the most anti-capitalist that has existed in the history of the Church. I wrote a book, if you remember, about Pope Francis, and how I studied his economic thinking. Rather, I didn't get into theological things, because it's not my subject. But Pope Francis, of course, shares this vision, and it comes from that Jesuit doctrine that represses the individual right to property. So Pope Francis, that's why he is also with Chavez, with Asado, with Maduro, with Fidel Castro, with leadership, Hanel and Castro, with all of them, because they are allies. It's not that he is 100% Marxist, but they are allies in the struggle against what the Pope thinks is the essential corrupt force, the human beings, which is capitalism. And this is very well explained by Lois Nota in her book about Jesuitism. We brought it to Chile. Remember? Jesuit populism is the name of the book. And then comes another Hitler quote that I want you to see better. The opinion that the use of a fortune without caring about its size is just a private matter of the individual must be corrected. Even more, in the socialist national state, because without the contribution of the community, no individual would have been able to enjoy such an advantage. Do you think the wild neoliberal capitalists, they say, hey, yes, it can be rich, but you can't say about your right to property? No, you can't decide what to do with your money. That's what neoliberalists defend. The other way around. We are criticized all the time because, in theory, supposedly, we don't care about the others and we want to earn a lot of money. And every rich person does what he wants with his money. Well, Hitler said that this couldn't be done. So there had to be a control. No, you can dispose of your wealth as you want. The state has to tell you how to dispose of your wealth. It has to be in function of civil society. Not a civil society, but the politician who supposedly represents the people. And there is an economic idea that is a complete fallacy that was repeated by Fernando Adrià with a debate once, which is the same one that Hitler is saying here, that or no, if you are rich because of the contribution of the community. It's not true. It's not true. Nobody gets rich because the community made him rich. It's the other way around. The individual, the person, gets rich in collaboration with the community, but enriching the community at the same time. Let's put it this way. If Argentina won the last football World Cup, except it's not that Messi won the World Cup, because the rest of the team was there for him. Yes, he needed it to win the World Cup, but the truth is that without Messi, he didn't win the World Cup. Do I explain it? It's not the same. The contribution he makes is much bigger than the others. Like Elon Musk's, who is bigger than the people who work in SpaceX. Like Henry Ford's, in his minute was more important than the people who worked in his plant. They were replaceable. Henry Ford was not replaceable. Elon Musk is not replaceable. None of them is replaceable. Andrew Carnegie was not replaceable. Right? I don't understand the whole argument. It's not about economy, but that's why he was a socialist. And here's Adam Smith. Why do I put him? So you can see. That's Adam Smith, who is the father of liberals. at least in economic matters, in modern times, or since this current exists, says that by pursuing his own interests often, the individual promotes the most effective society when he really intends to promote it. This is very important, because Adam Smith, the father of liberalism, not only realized the spontaneous order, but also warned us, be careful with the people who say that they come to do good to the community. They are the wolves with beaks. These guys will end up destroying it. Those are the Nazis. Those are the socialists. Those are the communists. The opposite of what these people say. And look at Exhibit A, Exhibit B, Exhibit C. As the judges in the United States say, this is already definitive. There's a speech from 1921 where Hitler, the typical Hitler's Klansman, talks for a long time and says that not the Zionists, but Judaism, the other the Bolsheviks, and he says that we are not fighting against Christian Jewish capitalism. We are fighting against all capitalism, because, of course, he identifies capitalism as a source of oppression, especially through the collection of interests, financial capitalism, which is Jewish capitalism, and everything of the people, not as a source of progress, but on the contrary, as a form of oppression. So we make the people completely free. Of course, in that, the Nazi regime ended and the people were completely free. Of course, you understand, right? You have to fight against capitalism if you want to establish totalitarianism. There has been no country where you have eliminated economic freedom that has not ended up being totalitarian. Not a single one. It is true, the accusation that the Nazis were almost, except for the Nazis in Germany, it makes no sense. And there is a quote that is usually attributed to Hitler. I have read it in several books attributed to Hitler. In another book recently I read a story attributed to Himmler, and at some point I thought that Hitler had said it, but it is said by Gregor Strass, who is president of the Socialist National Party. Right? He was president of the German Socialist National Party, and there come other people, many from their left, to say, yes, but Hitler did not like Strass because Strass was very socialist and leftist instead. Hitler was more right-wing, pro-capitalist. You have to see. And that's why they ended up killing him. In fact, they ended up killing Strass. He was in exile. Strass was too popular. He was doing very well, and he had a more dogmatic approach. But they were together, and they supported together the program at the 25 points of the 20th year. They worked together for a long time. Hitler agreed with Strass's proposals. So Hitler realized, completely as a politician, that he needed the industrialists. He needed a certain elite. So if he came to threaten them, as they were doing until then, almost with a Marxist revolution, that was what the communists were promoting, the second largest force or the largest force in Germany. In a minute, he would not have that support to move forward and achieve his goal. What? The theoretical principle continues to be shared in the socialist nation. Socialism is not only Hitler and a lot of other people. And this is the famous quote that he says, that we are socialist and mortal enemies of the economic system. But listen to Strass. He says Strass is Nazi. He is one of those who started the movement from the beginning. He is the president of the party. He says, we are socialist, we are mortal enemies of the current economic system, capitalist, with its exploitation of the weak economically, with its unfair wages, with its immoral evaluation of the people based on wealth and money instead of responsibility and revenue. And we are determined to destroy that system. Who wanted to bury capitalism? Who said in a statement that they wanted capitalism to disappear? Who talks all the time about inequality and how unfair the destruction of wealth in capitalism is? So this phrase could be said by any socialist in Chile. It could be said by Boric. They have said it. It doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter. They can bury neoliberalism. They can bury capitalism. I would like it to disappear, to exploit the weaker economically. This sounds like Marx. How can you say that this capitalist is saying the same thing? We were talking about Mussolini and Hitler. Now there's this other person from the whole movement saying that they are going to control capitalism and they want to destroy it. And here we are going to see Joseph Goebbels, who played a role, more or less, in the socialist movement. One of the greatest emblems of the socialist movement, the head of propaganda, the minister of propaganda after the riot, etc. And Goebbels writes, in 1926, a speech called Lenin or Hitler, as if they were confused. Which one do they want? Because both are very similar, he says. Both come from the same place. Both want the same thing. But, and then he says, why do you have to prefer Hitler? Because in the end they were both sold to international capitalism. Jews and I don't know what. But look at what he says. 1. Goebbels goes against capitalist system. Again, liberal capitalist democracy is so powerful that nothing to repair must be destroyed fundamentally, destroyed spiritually, and in terms of political power. Capitalism must be destroyed, he says. Goebbels. Was Goebbels liberal? Was he a capitalist or a Nazi? As far as I know, I don't know what the sources in the currency say, but Goebbels was a Nazi. There's the thing, the swastika. That no, this is not sponsored by a beer brand or anything like that. I'll explain it just in case I don't know. When he started, and then he says, let this capitalist system be destroyed. Capitalist, right? And he talks about the revolution, the need to direct the revolution, not only against the party or the system, but against the system itself. Marxist language. What do you know, Goebbels? He enters the Nazi party, seduced by Marx's ideas of class struggle. Goebbels was a great acquaintance of Marx. In fact, in that speech, he quotes them many times, probably in several of them. Marx was Jewish, then something. But he quotes them in his diagnosis and says if he was right. And then he says, the revolutionary idea of two spiritual movements. Imagine he talks about spiritual levels. His political expression in the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. In other words, he says the Communist Party and the Socialist National Party want the same thing. They want the destruction of the system. Goebbels says it. Without Goebbels, Hitler wouldn't have reached where he is now, because he takes it in a moment in which Hitler is very bad after they beat him in the elections of 1928, around there, or before, the one in 1926. The one in 1928 was better, I think. And then he starts to. He gives him the whole deployment. That you see, scenic, of the Nazis, which was a really phenomenal thing. Today it impresses everyone. The architect is this gentleman here, Eugenio Del Moli. Eugenio Del Moli fired in Buonaparte in Marx. And then, well, he says, the revolutionary in Canada incites two people who lead a minority. They decide the will of the future in this future, without the capitalism of liberal democracy. Lenin and Goebbels. That's Goebbels. And then he goes against Lenin. But then these guys come from the same place. Let's see. Nobody gives a speech explaining to people why they prefer it to be. If it and be completely the opposite, I would give a speech saying, well, Major or my law, right? You have the need to explain by the similarities that exist. Why do you have to choose one and not the other? No, because they are totally the opposite. Huh? It's like, hey, in case you have doubts about the next presidential election between Wirch and Cast, I'm going to explain them, because you have to explain the differences, because it seems that they are not clear. Here you have, well, here I have several appointments. They are all from Hitler, at least the last one. There is a report from the SS, where Hitler defends a centrally planned economy and shows admiration for the Soviet economic system. It is true that Hitler initially has statements where he defended private property in a rhetorical way and everything, because of what I tell you. Because of political pragmatism, he didn't want to scare the industrialists. He needed them, and he had this notion that the property could stay as long as it is subject to what the party tells it to do, and the industrialists do what the party tells them to do, and not individual interests. But here he says, the German economy is going to lose in the face of the Soviets, because they have, looking at the Soviet system, because they have a very good support. And here he explains his position. In 1937, I tell him I live in the German industry. For example, you have to produce this. If the German industry responds, we can't, then I'll take care of that. What does that mean? I take over your industry and I take care of it. But if the industry says, we'll do that, I'm glad I don't have to take care of that. But they have to do what Hitler says, take over private property. Right? Look at what he says in 1941, that the powers of a nation can only be achieved with a centrally planned economy. That's what Hitler says. Capitalists? The Nazis? Yes, indeed. If the Nazis are capitalists, I don't know. Marxists. And here they have another one. We have to proceed with rigor, that the whole production process has to be re-examined, and that the industrialists who don't want to submit the directives we issue will have to lose their plants, no matter if they will be economically ruined. Is that capitalism? Is that respect for private property? Of course. Many industrialists, and that's true, for surviving they submitted to what the party was saying, because they didn't want to lose their industries. Because, well, the typical term-based politician, there were some who submitted to the National Socialist Party. That's true, but that happened. And later they became slave workers, and everything else. And here Hitler explains how they solved some problems they had right. He says that it's because the direction of the economy had gradually become more controlled by the state. Only then it was possible to impose the general national goal against the interests. And he says, look at what he says, even after the war we couldn't give up the state control of the economy, because then each group of interests would be exclusively in compliance with their wishes. He says, we are controlling the economy. After the war we will continue to control it. Who likes to control the economy? Capitalists? Liberals? No. And look at you here. You have to have respect and conditioning for Stalin. He is the only man in the state that exists. There is no other. The only one. You have to have respect and conditioning for Stalin. He is a genius. Right? His economic planning is so overwhelming. Thus it only surpasses our own plan. In terms of patriotism, I can't be less than Stalin. We always surpass him. I have no doubt that there have been unemployed in the Soviet Union. Unlike capitalist countries like the United States, the Soviet Union is superior to the United States. That would be said by a capitalist, of course. I like the Soviet Union more than the United States. A capitalist of all kinds will prefer the Soviet Union over the United States. Do you realize that they are clowns? The people who say these things, I have already shown them so much evidence that at this point there will be no doubt, but there is a little doubt, because the era of a liberal business system says, this is a report of the SS, of the Jaime Himmler Foundation, Hitch Sabasso, all these Nazi leaders, except Goering, were very few things. They were losers. Losers. Yes, intelligent, but Himmler was a son of his mother, who dreamed of being a soldier. He was never a soldier, without any real physical courage. The only one who could say something for himself was Goering. The rest Himmler. Hitler himself, who was also a drug addict, was Goering too. Goering was addicted to morphine, etc. They were really, but the worst of the worst. And unfortunately for Germany and for the world, they were not large corporations, because they would have dedicated themselves to taking drugs, having a good time, and spilling money, and then we would have saved the war. But since they were Germans, they had to be consistent and consequent in pursuing their exquisite goals. Right? But anyway, It says that in the liberal world, businesses come first and then the state comes. No, that's wrong, says Hitler. Businesses can't come first. National Socialism says the state directs the economy. The state is not for businesses. Sorry, this is a report from the SS. A report from the SS. Well, but they go in the same line as Hitler. Now, this is a very important quote, because this man, Friedrich Pollock, is a Marxist, founder of the Frankfurt School, right? That is founded, known as the 23rd, as the Social Institute in Germany, founded by a German businessman, Felix Weil, actually Argentinian, of German origin, who had a fortune, and he created this institute. And there are important figures, like Horkheimer, Adorno. Yes, there are several there, who are from the Frankfurt School. Then there is Marcuse, all those people. And this man says, this Marxist, this man is left-wing. Nobody can doubt him. I think that Nazism should be described as the destruction of all the essential features of the property, except for one exception, which I don't know why. Even the most powerful companies were denied the right to establish new businesses in areas where the greatest benefits were expected, or to interrupt production when it became unprofitable. This is said by a Marxist person who fights with Horkheimer, because he is one of those who says that the Nazis are capitalists. And he says, no, you don't know what you're talking about. These rights were transferred in their entirety to the ruling groups. Well, property is worth nothing. One on the left says it. Who lived the time? Who lived there? Who violated Nazism? Who understood Marxist theory? Who was a socialist nationalist? And who violated the Nazi economic practice? And was curiously in agreement with Ludwig von Mises, who, as you know, was the greatest economist of the century, a liberal, who was also Austrian. He saw the boom of Nazism. He lived in Europe. He came from all that cultural context, and he sent a letter to the New York Times. Ludwig von Mises, almost capitalist, the director of capitalism. The Times, do you know what that means? They say it is strength, but the Times is economy, forced economy. That's how it was known in Germany, that there is no freedom. You do what power tells you. And von Mises says there, he says that he nominally maintains some institutions of capitalism, not really, but nominally. Our friend Pollock says, the work, the salaries were abolished. The government determines how much you pay to who, and where you work. There is no freedom of contract, nor of fixing salaries really. Super-liberal and economic, super. He says he fixes the salaries. He assigns here, I work in the place where I work. That's what the government does. In which country does that also? In everything he says he is a communist, but he says exactly the same. The private property has remained nominally intact, however. In the practice of the former businessmen, the condition of store managers has been reduced. Like the manager in the warehouse. What does the owner have to do? Well, the government tells them what and how to produce, at what prices and who to buy, at what prices and who to sell. The companies can protest, but in the end the government decides. The companies are therefore only a farce. The government is the government, not the demands of consumers. The government, not the market, fixes the income and expenses of each individual. This is socialism with the external appearance of capitalism, the total integration and control of all economic activities by the government. Some labels of the market economy are preserved, but their meaning is completely different from that of an authentic market economy. And it is exactly the same as Pollock, one liberal and the other more simple. This is a letter where Hitler is in power, and it is a better time. So, here to finish, what does Hitler say about his party? About Marx? He even has some statements. Hitler remembers the origins, moments when he was part of the movement. He was not a socialist, etc. He says my party at that time was composed of 90% of left-wing people. But it is obvious, if you saw what Strasser said, that they were anti-capitalists, that they wanted the revolution, that they wanted to eliminate private property. the 25 points. Now, probably Hitler exaggerates the numbers. But that is what he says. This is what he says in 1941, and in a book, this one, that in Spanish was written as Hitler told me. Hermann Rauschenk was a member of the National Socialist Party, and he talked to Hitler many times, and he wrote that in a book. Of the conversations he had, Hitler confesses to Rauschenk. He says, "I will not hide that I have learned a lot from Marxism," says Hitler. What interested me the most and instructed me about Marxism are his methods. All the National Socialism is contained in him. All the National Socialism is contained in Marxism. What does Hitler say? Now, there are also some different people who say, why did Hitler know about National Socialism? I have no idea. The society's gymnasiums, the corporate cells, the massive parades, the propaganda projects, especially for the mass, all these new methods of political struggle that were invented by Marxists, I did not need more than to take advantage of them and develop them to worry about, procure the instrument that we needed. Those are Hitler's words. No, but the Marxists, it is obvious, they persecuted the communists. Of course, the communists were, as von Hayek says, on the way to servitude since 1944. When Hitler was in power, the communists were a rival faction that thought exactly the same. In essential terms, yes, one had an internationalist element. The Nazism was to have a conservative element. One focused the question on the class. Much more, the other on the race, much more. But in general terms, the totalitarian essence, anti-capitalist of the two systems, or of the two movements, is the same, and the epistemological root of both ideologies is the same. Look at what Hayek says in his book, The Way to Servitude in 1944. Hayek says, look at the growth of these movements. He refers to communists and Nazis. He has been surprised by the number of leaders, from Mussolini. I told them the story, who began as socialists and ended up with fascists or Nazis. Surprising. How many Muslims do you know who are also Jewish? Which one? Why? Because there is something similar. Normally, for it to be such an important number of people, if it is something totally opposite, it is difficult to jump. It is not that simple. Hayek explains, what is true of the leaders of the movement? Well, even more so of the rest of the movement. And he says, the relative ease with which a young communist could become a Nazi or vice versa was well known in Germany, especially by the propagandists of both parties. Do you remember the speech of Goebbels, when he says, well, Lenin or Hitler? It is because the similarity between communism and Nazism is so much that the Nazis felt forced to attract people to their party because otherwise they would go to the Communist Party. This is why I try, and that is why Hayek observes. He says that it is easy for one to go to one side and the other, right? That is the point, and Goebbels identifies it perfectly in that speech, even if he later attacks the communists and everything, but he identifies it perfectly. And here Hayek says something that is key. They competed for the support of the same mentality, and they mutually reserved the hatred of the heretics. That is, when they are political factions, who fight for the same space, with the same mentality, with the same ends. They hate each other. They hate each other to death. Well, the internal political fights between members of the same group are worse, many times, than the opposition group fights. Only we know it in Chile. And he says, but his practice showed that they are closely rationed. They will make the real enemy the man with whom they had nothing in common, since the liberal is the one they could not wait to convince. Hayek started as a socialist. Did you know? The socialist Fabiano. And he is a person who obviously understood perfectly what was happening at the time in Europe. He came from Austria. So, is there any desert in this? That Nazism and communism are totally different. Nothing. Zero. Are there differences? Yes. There are differences. There are some blocking differences. There are some differences, right, in terms of organization of the economic system. Russia was a system that did not respect private property under the communists. The Nazis did not either, but at least they left a disguise of private property. The other stat decides everything. There are some differences, but they are of nuances. They are differences in essence, in the foundations. Right? Nazism and communism are Siamese. Right? Well, this was the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact between Stalin and Hitler. Hitler admired Stalin, we saw it. So to go to Eastern Europe, remember, back that, if I remember correctly, was in 1939. And what happened? The results of both systems. What are the differences? When you examine Nazi dictatorship and communist dictatorships in all countries, because Nazi dictatorship existed only in Germany and the occupied territories of Germany, but communism in all cultures existed in all parts of the planet for a long time. What are the differences in the results of the Nazis and the communists? If I invite them to my house one day, I have two kitchen, but they have nothing to do with it. No, but really, they have nothing to do with it. The ingredients are totally different. Do you see them the same? Do they have the same color? Do they have the same flavor? Do they have the same digestive effect? Oh yes, but are you talking about the same kitchen or not? Or are you going to believe the propaganda that the kitchen is different? Why do communism, Marxism, Socialism, and Nazism produce the same results? Because they are fundamentally identical in their opinion, because what they aspire to is the same. They are two totalitarian movements. This is German concentration camps. This is Soviet Union. You can take a picture. But what about the genocide under Stalin's Russia and Nazi Germany, or Mao's China? But in Mao's China, maybe for racial reasons, they would identify it more easily. And you have no idea where those pictures come from. It can be any of the two, because they are so similar, that it is almost absurd to try to make a difference between communists and Nazis. Nazis are communists, and the communists are Nazis. Well, of course. Yes, that is an argument that is made. The Nazis are calculated 25 million, without considering the war. The communists 150 million. I would say that, of course. But if the Nazis had had more time, the figures would be much bigger. But in essence they are the same. This in Cambodia, with Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot. Do you remember? How much did it eliminate? 20% of the population? 25% of the population? Do you remember? This is communism. And the typical thing that they tell you is that it was not. The true communism, you still have to apply it. It was not the right people. And now, when the right people arrive, which are us, it still works. Is that the argument that gives you? Of course, it was not communism. This is very interesting. This man, almost the last page, Rudolphus, was the one who organized all the extermination camps of Auschwitz, which were like 40 concentration camps. Rudolphus was in charge. He was told, you organize this, you do it all. What were they based on? In the Soviet concentration camps. He says it. This is said by him, which was later hung by the Hessians in Nuremberg, except for those who did not find Romania sentenced to death, as says it. The security office handed over to the commanders a complete collection of reports on the Russian concentration camps. These described in great detail the conditions and the organization of the Russian camps, according to what was provided by ex-prisoners who managed to escape. It was done very well, in the fact that the Russians had eliminated a whole group of people through forced labor. If the organizer of the concentration camps of Auschwitz is telling you, maybe we get inspired in the concentration camps of the communists, I would say that you have to believe him a little. Even more because if you go and examine them, they are identical. Maybe the Germans did not escape anyone, which makes them worse. In that sense, well, they are identical. So, I don't know if you have read this book, if you had ever been able to get it. This is a book from 1997. You know that several of these, especially Stephen Kauto, is an ex-communist. He was a communist, and he wrote in this book, The Black Book of Communism, published by Harvard University Press in the United States, and it is the most detailed story that exists about the crimes of communism, the most detailed story. And then with all that equipment, they say why are the Nazis demonized, of course, but not the communists. The communists were just as criminal, or worse. Just as criminal or worse. They say it in this book. Read it if you can, buy it. The Black Book of Communism. I know a part that seems key to this presentation. What does it say? Comparing communism with Nazism, both groups, both doctrines. I am what I mean. The purpose of terror was to exterminate a group that had been designated as an enemy. To exterminate it, although it was only a small fraction of society. It had to be eradicated to satisfy this genocidal impulse. Therefore, the techniques of segregation and exclusion used in a class totalitarianism, communism, are very similar to the techniques of racial totalitarianism. The Nazis, the future Nazi society, would be built on a pure race. The future communist society would be built on a purified proletarian people, from the scum of the bourgeoisie. Change the subject, but this is all the same. It's all the same. Do you notice? The restructuring of these two societies was conceived in the same way. The methods are the same, even if the repressed measures were different, in some cases emphasizing one thing than another. Therefore, it would be absurd to pretend that communism is a form of universalism, that it cares about human rights everywhere. It's a global thing. It would have a global purpose. The Nazis also had it. They would understand that they would not have been satisfied with staying in Germany. They would have expanded. They took over all of Europe in a minute. But just as the Nazis consider a part of humanity to be unworthy of existing, this is the racial point. The difference is that the communist model is based on the class system. The Nazi model on race and territory, which does not mean that the communists did not have racial issues and ethnic cleansing. They did. The communists did ethnic cleansing, and they also pursued the Jews interestingly. This is well documented. It does not mean that the Nazis did not have this element of class struggle, which they also had. But the emphasis was, in one case much more on race, and in another case much more on class. And this is the last page. This is a museum, a foundation. In the United States, it is worth following it. And they reach this conclusion. There are other estimations that are even bigger, of 150 million. But this is what communism did. Are they going to say that this is less bad than Nazism? They are totalitarian collectivist doctrines, and in essence both. And this is important for our effect, are anti-capitalist, anti-liberal, anti-Christian, and anti-individualist reactions. That is, they are related to everything we believe as classical liberals. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.